he found that Celine was there at the door. It seemed that she took her time to dress up because Jack could see that she wasn't wearing the usual official dresses. She was wearing a pink dress that reached slightly below her knees, exposing her legs that were so alluring. On her shoulder, there was a small white handbag that had a long handle, enabling the body of the handbag to reach slightly below her hips. She had applied a thin layer of makeup on her face, emphasizing her cherry lips. Jack had forgotten that he was actually looking at a person and not a mannequin. He forgot to even welcome her in or to get out so that they could depart because he was completely enthralled by Celine's beauty that was being shown by her dressing code. "Are you not done staring yet?" Celine asked, snapping Jack out of his daze. Although she was putting a sour face, she was actually happy that Jack was caught by her beauty. "I'm not done yet. Can I continue to stare and enjoy your beauty for a little while longer?" Jack shook his head. Although he had indeed come back to the present, he still wanted to continue looking at this exquisite piece of artwork. Celine blushed when she heard Jack's words. She looked at him and met his blue eyes that were staring at her without even blinking. Although it was true that she enjoyed being appreciated by Jack, she was still shy to be under his scrutinizing gaze. "Humph, we are going to be late. So, we better leave. If it's just looking, you can continue looking as we are going to spend the day together, aren't we?" Celine snorted as she feigned displeasure. Seeing her like this, Jack simply smiled and said, "You said it yourself. I hope that you won't be complaining that I'm staring at you a lot. After all, you are the one that has given me the permission." Celine turned around before she spoke. "It's not like you have ever asked for permission before." Her voice was so low in that, had it not been for Jack's sharp senses, he wouldn't have heard her at all. "Let's go. We will start going around till you confirm that you are going to have a game." Before Jack could say a word, Celine continued. Although she tried acting calm, her heart was already beating erratically, as if it would jump out of her chest the next second. She was wondering if it was true that Jack would be staring at her the whole day. Although she would like to think that he was joking, she knew that Jack had always been honest with her. So, she couldn't help but be nervous about how he was going to look at her in the streets and in front of a big group of people. Jack followed behind Celine and they left the hotel. Jack had wanted to drive the Lamborghini, but Celine refused. It turned out that she had already transferred her car from Inchoate City to Car 2. "I'm the one who's going to drive you today," Celine stated. Being given a ride, Jack wouldn't refuse. He could as well use this chance to feed his eyes to the maximum possible. Seeing that Jack didn't reject her, Celine was pleased. This was him trusting her, right? After all, Jack didn't even ask where she was taking him and simply boarded her car. Celine smiled as she entered the car before starting to drive away from the hotel's parking lot. On the road, Jack's eyes were still fixated on Celine. This made Celine blush, and as time went by, she blushed even more. She couldn't help but look at Jack before asking, "Are you seriously going to look at me like that the whole day?" "Yes," Jack replied without batting an eye. Seeing that he was serious, Celine could only try and fix her mind on driving, trying to completely forget that Jack was looking at her. As he looked at her side profile, Jack had to admit that Celine was a beauty of high magnitude. Even though the layer of makeup on her face was only small, it had actually made her originally beautiful face to be even more eye-catching. But Jack wondered how long it took for her to dress up like this. He was sure that as a girl, Celine would have had to spend a good period of time in front of a mirror, choosing the type of makeup, the dress that she would wear, the hairstyle that she would have, and so on. But she had actually stated that she would be at the hotel within 40 minutes. So, he wondered if she had actually changed before coming, or she was dressed even before calling him. What Jack didn't know was that his thoughts were along the line, just a little distance from the truth. Celine had spent a long time just to dress up. She had actually decided that she would actually meet up with Jack on this day. She had asked her mother so that she could be free on this day since early morning. And although she had gotten the permission the previous day, since morning, she was quite nervous about what to do so that she could spend her day with Jack. She had been wondering if something amazing would happen during their time together. But all the same, with the help of Faith, who had already returned from Inchoate City, she was able to dress up well. She had remained pondering for a long time before she finally made up her mind to be with Jack on this day. She would try her best to show Jack that she actually loved him. Then, she would wait and see his response. Of course, she wouldn't tell him openly that she actually loved him. Even if he was busy, she would just accompany him. On the other hand, if he was free, she would take him out. So, that was what she did. She had managed to find that he was actually free. So, she decided that he had to accompany her. Jack continued to stare, and he didn't even notice that they had actually arrived in front of a mall. This was Pride Mall, whose branch was available in Inchoate City. Jack alighted alongside Celine. He wasn't sure as to why she had brought him here, but he wanted her to tell him without him even asking about it. He followed her, and they got into the mall. They attracted the attention of many due to their looks, but they didn't care about it. And not long after, they arrived in front of a store that sold clothes. Jack's brows rose as he wondered what they were doing here. He could have said that they were actually here to do shopping for Celine if this was a women's store. But this was for men. Could it be that she was here to get the clothes for her father? Perhaps it would be his birthday soon? As Jack continued imagining, the duo then entered the store. Their looks immediately attracted the salesladies present in the store. Although Jack was simply wearing casual clothes, as people who were dealing with clothes, they could immediately tell that the clothes that he was wearing were made from cashmere. On the other hand, Celine was dressed nicely. Her bag was one with a Gucci brand name on it. This could tell them that the two of them were definitely rich people. So, they immediately swarmed towards them. It seemed that Celine was already used to such a scene, as she simply chose one of the young ladies among the group. Then, she went to one of the shelves and began picking clothes. Jack, on the other hand, decided to wait for her. He wasn't the one here to get clothes, so he watched from the side as she seriously picked clothes one by one. Just after about 2 minutes, she came back towards him holding a white shirt. Jack's brows raised again when he saw this scene. He wondered why she was heading towards him instead of going to the saleslady so that she could pack it for her. "Jack, why don't you try this shirt out?" Celine asked. Jack was stunned. Why was he the one that was supposed to try the clothes out? Could it be that she was buying the shirt for him? Looking at the size, he realized that the shirt seemed to match his own physique. Shrugging his shoulders, Jack took the shirt and went ahead to change it. And Jack was amazed the moment that he put on the shirt. It was just his own size. He wondered if Celine had actually taken his measurements when he was sleeping. Otherwise, how could she really know his exact size? Forgetting about that, Jack came out of the changing room with the shirt on. The shirt on his body gave him a different vibe. Although it still looked casual, it had a hint of nobleness on him. Even the other salesladies and the girls that had come in the store with their partners couldn't help but stare at him. The shirt outlined his features well. It wasn't baggy at all, but it wasn't tight as well. It was just good enough to showcase the muscles of his hand and chest. Celine looked at him with shiny eyes as she looked at Jack. Although he was still handsome with his usual clothes, he really looked even more handsome in the shirt. "Jack, you should be wearing this way every day," Celine suggested as she sized Jack up. "Really?" Jack asked. He was doubtful about it. Although it was true that he had several shirts, he really didn't like the long-sleeved ones. He only wore them at times, but it was rare. "Of course." Celine nodded before she went ahead and handed him another shirt. She had picked this one when he was still changing. Jack took the shirt and changed into it as well. Although it was also a long-sleeved shirt, the design was completely different from the previous one. But surprisingly, it still managed to bring out the same vibe as the previous one. After Celine selected a few more pairs of shirts, she finally completed the payment. Although Jack had wanted to do the payment, she was the one that had insisted that he had to leave things to her. As the men watched Celine buying clothes for Jack, they couldn't help but get envious. After all, while Jack was receiving clothes from a girl, they on the other hand were having their wallets being sucked dry, let alone clothes that were worth a few $1,000s. Even something that was worth $50 would never come from them. They only knew how to receive and not to give. Seeing their partner's expression as they gazed at Celine, the ladies simply harumphed as they gazed at Celine with displeased expressions. Jack and Celine had just gotten out of the store when his phone rang. It was Jonathan. "Jack, are you sure that you are good at basketball?" Jonathan asked. "If I say that I'm second, then there should be no first," Jack stated seriously. "Humph, what a narcissist." Jonathan snorted before continuing. I have a deal where you can win money, a good amount at that. All that you need to do is to win the basketball game against a professional basketball player. A one-on-one? Jack asked to confirm. He didn't want to waste much time playing a full game. As long as he defeated the professional and earned money, then he would have completed the system task. Come on, Jack. How can a one-on-one match be interesting? It's going to be a full game. Though, you will be in one of the teams there. Of course you will be starting, that's why I asked you about your skills. Jonathan sighed as he spoke. But that will take a long time. Jack complained. He wasn't willing to spend the whole hour just to play something that he wasn't passionate about. This is the best that I can do. So, it's up to you whether you agree to play or not. If you are not going to play, I might as well look for another person to replace you. Jonathan said. His voice wasn't accommodating to say the least. Jack could only shake his head. Since there were only 2 days, Jack would not give up on a chance that had presented itself. Since this was the only game that was available at the moment, he might as well take it. Although it was no longer going to be a one-on-one against the professional, it was still a match against professionals. Even if he had to carry the whole team, as long as he won, then there would be no problem at all. Okay then, at what time am I supposed to be there? Jack agreed before asking. Just make sure to be at Gunja Arena before 3 o'clock. Jonathan replied before hanging up. After leaving the mall, Jack and Celine went into a restaurant. There, they had their lunch. And once again, Celine insisted that she was the one that was going to foot the bill. Since I'm the one that's taking you out, I'll take care of the bills. Celine stated seriously. Hearing her words, Jack began doubting his identity as a man. Could it be that Celine saw him as a girl or something? After all, this was a line that a man was supposed to say to a girl, right? Shaking his head to dispel the thought, Jack followed Celine. He had already informed her of the venue and the time that he was supposed to be there. So, there was no need to worry that they would be late. Currently, it was still 1:30 p.m. There was still an hour and a half before the time for the game. So, the two of them went around. Celine had made sure to take him to the places that he had not known of, even though he had been strolling the city for almost a week. They did several simple things like buying some ice cream as it was summer, taking candies, and playing games on the street stalls. But of course, the games at the stalls ended up with Jack being chased away by the stall owners who were already crying bloody tears due to the losses that they had suffered. Celine had already parked the car to the side, and they were simply moving around on foot. After over an hour of enjoying themselves, the duo thought that it was finally time for them to head to the venue of the game. So, they went back to where the car was parked before Celine drove towards the venue. Gunja Arena, one of the several basketball arenas present in Kartu City. The arena was big enough to accommodate 15,700 fans. Although it wasn't the biggest, at least, it was considered good enough amongst the mid-level basketball teams. Although the stadium had such a huge capacity, it was almost empty. The seats that were occupied were those that were at the front. And in total, there was only about 300 people who were here to watch the game that would take place here. Additionally, the temperament of the people here was different from the usual basketball fans. These guys had a demeanor of big shots, and they were all wearing branded clothes. Whether it was the ladies or the gentlemen, they all looked excited. After all, this wasn't just any type of basketball game, but a competition between two opposing factions in the industry. At this time, inside the locker room, there was a group of 15 people who were engaged in a heated discussion. There was one thing common in the expressions of all these people. It was that they were all angry and at the same time frustrated. These were the players of a basketball team known as Roosters. They were currently talking about how there was going to be another person that was going to play instead of one of them. I don't know what coach thought about, so that he brought a person that we don't even know to play this match. That's right. I have been playing NBA for 5 years now, but I have never heard of a person called Jack. This is completely absurd. Maybe he is from abroad? What abroad? Do you think that they would rather have a player from abroad playing a game here with a mid-level basketball team? And look at the time. It's already 10 minutes to 3, but that guy hasn't even arrived. What kind of attitude is this? I suggest that we all team up and tell the coach that we don't agree on this matter. That's right. Just then, there was a sound of footsteps, and before long, a man with black hair that had several spots of gray walked in. He was wearing a black track suit, and there was a whistle that was hanging around his neck. Seeing the man, the players stood up and spoke in unison. "Coach." Just sit down." The man nodded and waved at them. Then, as he looked at the players before him, he suddenly noticed that there was someone who was missing. "Hasn't the person that I told you come yet?" he asked with a frown. They were supposed to be on the court by 3. So, they were supposed to be getting ready to go to there by now. But Jack had yet to arrive? "That's right, coach. Just look, what kind of player is this?" "Yes, it's already almost time for the game. Yet, he hasn't arrived. Till the time that he's going to change, how long would that be?" "Coach, you know that we have never played with him before. For such an important game, I think that it would be better if we play ourselves rather than having an unfamiliar person with us." He's correct. We aren't familiar with his moves. So, it's obvious that our coordination won't be good. As he listened to the complaints, the coach could only let out a frustrated sigh. He was the one that had been developing the team since it was a very low-level team. It had been rising with his support till the mid-level. But there was only one problem. He wasn't financially stable to be able to support the team at this level by himself. Having no other choice, he decided to seek support. He had found someone who was looking for a team that could play for him as they were competing against one of his competitors for a plot of land that was up for development. Since neither of the sides could agree, they had decided that they would decide who was going to take the plot according to the results. The two sides had agreed to take 2 mid-level teams. So, when that person knew that they were in need of financial support, he had agreed to take them in. As long as they won the match, they would gain his support. Their performance in the league wasn't bad. So, they had agreed. But their opponents just happened to be their archenemies. They had been competing with each other for long. But the number of wins and losses for both sides were the same. That meant that today's match would decide who was going to take the lead. They were not willing to lose. So, the players had been long prepared for the match. But just today, the coach came in and told them that there was a change. There would be a single player who didn't belong to either of the team. And this player will have to participate in the match. The players were indignant when they heard about this. Although they didn't know who was going to play on their opponent's side, they thought that they would play better as they had been practicing together for such a long time, and the coordination between them was so good. Even the coach didn't want that to happen. But since this was organized by the one that had given them the chance, there was no way that he could refuse. "I don't want it either, but we don't have a choice," the coach stated. Just then, someone entered the locker room. It was none other than Jonathan. He looked around and frowned. "Where's Jack?" he asked the coach. "He has yet to arrive. I wonder if he will be able to do some warm-ups before the match begins. There's less than 10 minutes, coach stated. Jonathan's frown deepened. He took his phone and made a call. "Hey Jack, you are late. Where the heck are you? Didn't I tell you that you were supposed to be here by now?" "What? You told me to be there by 3 p.m. There's still almost 10 minutes before the time. How can it be that I'm late?" Jack's voice came through. Jonathan's face darkened. "I told you that the match was going to start at that time. That means that you were supposed to be here and ready to play by 3 o'clock. So, where are you now?" Jonathan asked. "Celine, how far are we from Gonja Arena?" Jonathan heard Jack. It seemed that the two were together. Thinking of this, he kind of understood. Jack was late because he was spending time with Celine. Wasn't this guy so serious about the match? I found one that's perfect, and yet he's out there flirting. Now, I'm getting pissed off just thinking that while I was out to look for an opportunity for him, he was actually enjoying himself. We should be there in around 8 minutes. Didn't you say that we should be there by 3 o'clock? We will be there 2 minutes earlier. Celine's voice was heard next. Jonathan almost spewed a little of blood when he heard Celine's serious voice. They were still thinking of arriving at 3 o'clock? That was when the match was going to start. Just what are you guys doing? You should hurry up and get here before 3. Otherwise, you will be late. Jonathan shouted. Why are you blaming me? You should have been clear that the game will take that amount of time. Why the heck did you say that I should be there by 3 o'clock? You should have said 2:30 p.m. instead. Jack complained before hanging up. If he could, Jonathan would have made sure to beat Jack up. But there was nothing that he could do. After all, he wasn't as strong as Jack. As for his financial capabilities, that was something that he wasn't sure about. After all, Jack had even managed to acquire the Me 26M helicopter that could only be acquired after a person had a certain amount of influence. Shaking his head, Jonathan turned towards the coach and said, "I guess you guys will have to play the first quarter without him. He will be here soon." The coach had been listening from the side as Jonathan made the call. Although it was true that he couldn't hear Jack's words, it was true that he could easily tell what the other party was implying just from Jonathan's expression and responses. Although it could be said that he was disappointed that Jack was late, it was also true that he was also happy that they would play the first quarter by themselves. Even though the first quarter consisted of only 12 minutes, it was enough for his boys to prove their capabilities. If they performed well, perhaps Jonathan would allow them to play by themselves. "All right," the coach replied before turning to the players. "You heard it. Just like always, the first 5 will start the match. As for the second quarter, there will be a substitution. But I hope that the ones that are going to play in the first quarter will not disappoint me." "Yes, coach," the players replied enthusiastically. They were so excited that they were actually going to start the match without Jack. Although only 5 of them would be playing before Jack arrived, they were confident enough that these 5 would be able to perform well enough. When they got to the court, these players were stunned as they looked at their opponent's side. It wasn't because the opponent had changed players or something. It was just because there was someone that they had never expected to meet here. "Isn't that Damien?" "That's right. He's from one of the top teams. What is he doing here?" "I think this is just obvious. He's wearing a jersey, so he must be here to play." "Hiss, are you kidding me? They are actually going to have Damien in their team? How's this even acceptable?" Maybe that's why they had called this guy called Jack. And, while the other side already has a top player ready to start, on the other hand, our best player hasn't even arrived. This game is going to be difficult. Anyway, we will have to work harder in the game. No mistakes are allowed. Agreed. The group from the opponent's side walked towards them. They had smug looks as they followed behind Damien, who had taken the lead of the team. Damien looked at the guys from Roosters. Seeing not a single familiar face amongst the group, Damien frowned and asked, "Where is the guy that has joined your team?" "He's not here yet." One of the players, who was wearing a number 20 jersey, responded. "Ah?" Damien wasn't expecting such an answer at all. After all, the game was already about to begin, but his opponent had yet to arrive. On the other hand, the guys behind Damien began sneering as they talked sarcastically. "Maybe he has heard of you and decided to give you the respect that you deserve. So, he decided not to show up. Perhaps he thought that he was better at the game and thought that this basketball match is not good enough for him to play. That guy is chickened out, I'm sure of it. Hey, keep it down already. Do you want them to think that we are looking down on them? Hee, this time, we are surely going to win and take the lead. I heard that the Roosters are financially unstable recently. Is that so? Then why don't they come to me? I can invest a few $1,000s in their team. Come on. What can a few $1,000s do for a team at such a level? You don't know? That's just enough to pay them since they usually play a lousy game. Now that you remind me, I think that a few $1,000s is too much. Perhaps they can share $100? Man, you are too ruthless." As they chatted off loudly, they completely ignored the furious gazes that were thrown at them. After all, although the Roosters players might be angry, but what could they do to them? And if they really wanted to fight them, it wasn't like they themselves were afraid of fighting. These cases are occasional in NBA. Damien, on the other hand, failed to understand what was going on. This was actually a game that was going to decide a project that was worth billions of dollars. How could it be that there was no opponent on the other side? Could it be that he had given up? Although he wouldn't want to participate in the match since he had no opponent of the same level, as him playing against these guys would he considered bullying, he had no choice. He had to make sure that the side that he represented won. At the end of the day, he had already agreed to make the side win. What's more, there were benefits that came with him winning the match. And since he had to win, he might as well win things clearly. It wouldn't be his fault that he would bully the guys here because it was the other party's star that had decided not to come and participate in the game. Without saying a word further, he returned to his side and waited for the match to start. When the others saw his actions, they too retreated, but not without throwing gloating gazes towards the Roosters. After the two sides had 5 players each, the game officially began. The game was tough, and both sides made sure to put in their all. But a person with a keen eye would definitely notice that the other side that had Damien with them was relaxed. Although they were playing seriously, it couldn't be compared to the Roosters. Even though the Roosters players had made a lot of effort, they just couldn't play the game well because they were under great pressure. They were playing against a top player while they themselves were only mid-level. Amongst the spectators, Jonathan was frowning as he watched the game. The Roosters were definitely at a disadvantage. Seated beside him was a man with a shiny bald head and a pair of black glasses. A wonder why he was wearing them even though they were indoors. Maybe to look cool? Whatever. Jonathan, what's going on? You told me that there will be a player here. I didn't look for anyone because I trusted you to find one. So, where the heck is the player that you talked about? The Baldy asked. Seeing the way that the Roosters were being dominated, he couldn't help but get nervous. He was the one that had organized for the one professional player to be added to the game after Jonathan's suggestion. Now, there was no professional player on his side. He couldn't help but think that Jonathan had perhaps sold him out. Worry not. I know the importance of that piece of land. So, I won't make a mistake. It's just that he's going to be here a little bit late. I had told him to be here by 3 o'clock as that is when the game would start. But he thought that he was supposed to be here by 3 o'clock before the preparations of the game begin. Jonathan explained. He too was anxious. He was seeking a cooperation with the Baldy in a certain project. But in order to get him to agree, Jonathan had to help him in winning the land first. As the two of them discussed on what to do, Jack and Celine had arrived in the locker room. There, they found a man who was pacing around anxiously. When he noticed the two of them coming in, his eyes lit up. But when he saw their faces, the hope in his eyes dimmed. Mr. Jonathan, when is he going to arrive? Those boys are surely no match for Damien. The man stated. Jack and Celine looked at each other, each of them thinking the same thing. There it goes again. Ahem. I'm not Jonathan, I'm Jack. Jack cleared his throat before he spoke. You are Jack? Mr. Jonathan, are you going to replace Jack in the game? The man asked again. No matter what he could see, this person in front of him was Jonathan, who had just changed his clothes, his hairstyle, and he brought a girl with him. If you think that this little trick of yours can cheat this experienced person, then you are naive. You should have at least put on some makeup to change your appearance first. The coach thought. I'm sorry that I'm late. Jonathan that you were talking about is my cousin. He told me to be here by 3 o'clock. And I arrived at the parking lot about 20 seconds before 3. So, I believe that I'm on time according to the appointment, but late according to the game schedule. Jack stated as he looked at the Vacheron Constantin Traditionnel on his left wrist. Just before the coach could say a word, Jonathan entered the locker room. Looking at the Jack, who was still dressed in his casual wear, he immediately began berating him. Jack, you are already late, and the first quarter has already began. So, you'll have to go in during the second quarter. Although the first quarter has only began, the team is already being dominated. You should have been clear with your words before. Now, you shouldn't be blaming me, you know? Jack shrugged. All right, it's my fault. Can you at least be serious and change? You better hurry up, because we are already losing. Jonathan stated anxiously. What's the difference now? Jack asked. The team has already been beaten 9-0. Jonathan stated seriously. What the hell? There are actually 2 of them? So, are they twins or cousins? The coach screamed in his mind. Jack wondered, hasn't the game just started? How can there be such a big difference in less than 5 minutes? It's their top player. He has already scored 3 3-pointers by the time that I left there. Jonathan stated. Jack frowned. He wondered if it was true that there were other players playing there. If a single person could easily score 3 times in less than 5 minutes, was there someone that was defending really? As if reading Jack's mind, Jonathan spoke. You know, the attacks are already heavy on the Roosters. There have been more than 7 shots. They managed to block 2 while the other 2 missed. That's the reason for the score at that moment. As for now, I'm not sure if they have scored again. Is that player of theirs that strong? Jack asked. Exactly. And that's the reason as to why we want you to get there as soon as possible. Otherwise, things are definitely not going to get good. The first quarter is already almost coming to an end. Jonathan replied, "Yeah, that person is Damien. You should know him, right?" The coach said as he looked at Jack. "Damien? Never heard of him before." Jack shook his head in response. "Are you serious, Jack? You play basketball, but you have never heard of Damien, one of the best basketball players in the country?" Jonathan looked at Jack incredulously as he asked with disbelief clear in his voice. "What? You are expecting me to know him just because he's one of the top players in the country?" Jack asked. Clearly, even after hearing that the other party was one of the best players, he didn't care. "Jack, are you sure that you can play basketball?" Jonathan asked doubtfully. Although he knew that with Jack's strength, as long as he wanted, he could dribble the ball from one end to the court before slam dunking it. But the question was whether he even knew the rules of basketball. If it was true that he knew nothing about it, it was then a sure bet that there was nothing that he could do, as there would be several fouls, one after the other. In this way, even if he held the ball in his hands, there would be nothing that he could do to salvage the situation. Perhaps he might as well cripple the team further, as it was already a cripple in front of Damien, as long as there was nobody to stop him. Anyway, I'm not a basketball enthusiast, so I don't watch the games at all. But don't worry, if I didn't know what I was talking about, I wouldn't have come here. I would have continued enjoying my time with Celine. Jack shrugged before he went ahead to change. Celine, on the other hand, blushed furiously under the questioning gazes of the coach and Jonathan. After changing, Jack left the locker room with the coach while Celine left with Jonathan. She was going to be a spectator, and so she could take on one of the best seats present in the front. When Jack got onto the court and looked at the basketball, he felt some kind of feeling as if he had been playing this kind of game for a long time now. This was just an instinct due to the presence of the memories and muscle memory that had been merged into his mind and body. In less than 10 seconds, Jack felt extremely confident that he could play the game better than anyone else. And looking at the players that were sweating and dribbling, shooting, or blocking the ball, Jack shook his head. He was disappointed because he felt that the level that the best player that they were talking about was in was just mediocre. He could find many ways of breaking through his defense or blocking his attacks with an unbreakable wall. Seeing Jack shaking his head, the coach thought that Jack had given up and thought that the situation was hopeless. He couldn't blame him, though, because he himself knew that it was going to be hard for them to turn the tables. Not speaking of the fact that Jack was going to be late to enter the game, the opponents were already at 23 points to 2. The Roosters had managed to score 2 points. But, in just a few minutes, perhaps because the spirit of the Roosters had waned, in the less than 7 minutes that Jonathan was away, there were already 14 points. "Don't worry, just play your game the best that you can." The coach patted Jack's shoulder before he joined the other players that were watching from the side. Just looked at him and thought to himself, "Am I supposed to play well here? Just a simple game, and all these guys will not be able to hold me. So, if I dare to play the game at my best, won't I destroy the passion that these guys have towards basketball?" Jack simply shook his head in his heart. There was no need for him to apply much of his skills. Furthermore, there was still the fact that he was stronger than all the guys here. Even that Damien would be no match for him, even though he was almost 2 meters tall. Although Jack was tall and was 187 centimeters, compared to the basketball players who were usually at 190 centimeters, or some of them being even 2 tall, Jack was considered short. Looking at Damien, who was holding the ball, Jack watched silently as he wondered what this guy was going to do with the ball. He dribbled up to the 3-point line and faked a pass to one of his teammates. The defense started shifting to the left, thinking he passed the ball. Damien shot the 3-ball. The sound of the ball as it ripped through the net made the crowd get hype. With 30 seconds left in the first quarter, the game is at 26-2 and the Roosters team had the ball, dribbling the ball trying to waste some time. The Roosters point guard started to dribble between his legs and tried to hit the opponent with an in-and-out move, but he tripped over his shoe and lost the ball. The opponent sprinted to the loose and hustled down the court for the easy layup with 10 seconds left in the quarter. As the team ran to get back on defense, the opponent had already passed the ball to Damien. Damien wasted no time, as it was already almost time for the first quarter to end. So, he shot the ball from a 3-pointer line. The crowd alongside his teammates watched as the ball arced towards the hoop. Luckily, it missed the target and hit the backboard. Before the Roosters could get happy that Damien had missed, the ball bounced from the backboard and dropped into the hoop. That. The sound of the ball bouncing on the ground was heard. At the same time, the whistle was blown as the official waved his hand to indicate the end of the quarter. The players left the court. While the opponents had raised their heads high, the Roosters could only walk out with disappointment clear on their faces. The coach welcomed them there. When they arrived here, they saw Jack. They wondered why he was wearing the jersey. "Mr. Jonathan, you are going to play?" one of the players asked. It was also at this point that the other players noticed Jack's presence. He had been standing at the side while they themselves were focusing on the game. So, they didn't notice when he arrived. Jack shook his head at this. Celine and the other girls already knew how to differentiate between him and Jonathan as their tastes in fashion were different. Furthermore, if one looked keenly, he'll be able to notice that Jack was more handsome. Well, that's what Jack thought. The coach happened to hear what they were saying. So, he hurriedly went ahead and said, "That's Jack. He's Mr. Jonathan's cousin." "Cousin? How can cousins look the same?" One of the players set out their suspicion. "Well, you can look there. Mr. Jonathan is seated there. You might as well go ahead and ask him about that." The coach waved his hand. Before the players could start talking again, the coach began talking about the few mistakes that he had seen during the last minute of the game. "You guys, I know that you are dominated by the opponents, but that's not a reason for you to give up on playing well. You need to make sure that you do your best from the start of the game to the end, no matter the results." He went on to talk for a few more seconds before he said, "Jack is going to enter in this quarter." He then looked at Jack and asked, "What position are you going to play?" "Just any position will do. But according to the situation, I'll have to play as a power forward so that I can easily counter Damien," Jack stated before looking at the players and asked, "Can you guys handle the other players?" "Of course. If it's just them, then it's not a problem at all." One of them, who was also the captain, nodded. Then, he looked at Jack before asking, "Why don't you play as a small forward? With your height and body size, it is good for you to play there." The others nodded in agreement. Although they had thought that they didn't need Jack, when they faced Damien, they knew that they were no opponents at all. So, at this point, they could only try Jack and see what kind of skills he possessed. "Worry not about that. You just focus on giving the ball to me and defending against the other players. They shouldn't pass you." Jack shook his head. He himself knew about his strength. Though, he wasn't going to use that advantage that much. The resting period was only 2 minutes. So, the time was over so fast and Jack went to the court. When Damien saw him and the position that he was going to play, he smiled and asked, "Are you their star player?" He had never seen Jack before, and neither had he seen him during the first quarter. They had previously stated that Jack had yet to arrive. So, he could easily tell that Jack was the player that had been brought over to play against him. But he had never seen or heard of him before. He was curious about where they found him. Perhaps. Jack shrugged, not willing to explain anything. "Humph." Damien snorted when he saw Jack's not caring look. He asked, "Want to have a competition with me?" Jack looked at him as if he was looking at an idiot before asking, "Aren't we already competing? Or what are we doing in the court?" Hearing Jack's question, Damien was at first dumbfounded. It was only after a moment that he realized that what Jack had said was indeed true. They were already competing against each other. So, what was the use of the question? Ahem. What I meant was that we would compete between the two of us. I would like to see how good you are. Damien cleared his throat before speaking. "Not a problem. But you should know that you have already lost." "Let's see it then," Damien said angrily. On the other side, Jonathan had arranged for Celine to sit next to him in the front row seats. He believed that since she was Jack's girl, she deserved the respect that Jack would receive. The others who were watching the game couldn't help but scrutinize Celine. They wondered who she was. After all, this was the first time that they were seeing her. And from the way that Jonathan was treating her, it was obvious that he had some kind of respect for her. Furthermore, she was a beauty. They wondered if she was Jonathan's lover or something. After all, to be able to sit beside Jonathan, this stated that he thought that they were at the same level. "Are you sure that the person that you called has already arrived?" the Baldy asked. "Of course. He's my cousin. So, there is no need to worry about the game." Although he said these words, Jonathan was still worried about having a person that actually didn't like playing basketball to represent him. Baldy looked at Celine. There was a hint of lust in his eyes as he looked at her. But he managed to restrain himself because he knew that although Jonathan had come to ask for partnership with him, it was not because they were in the same level or he was at a higher level than Jonathan. Instead, it was because Jonathan wasn't using his family influence in this deal that he was asking him for the cooperation. Otherwise, he wouldn't have wasted a lot of time with the game. Suddenly, an idea popped up in his mind. He looked at Jonathan with bright eyes before asking, "Is this lady here your girlfriend?"
No.
Jonathan's reply was short and straight to the point. Baldy's eyes shone even brighter as he asked again, "What about you give me a chance to take her out?" Jonathan's expression turned cold the moment that he heard these words. Celine, on the other hand, was already angry at the glances that Baldy was throwing at her. Now, he was actually asking for an opportunity of courting her? Not to speak of the fact that he was already a man in his 40s. He wasn't handsome at all. Not to mention that Celine wasn't into mature men. There was a fact that she loved Jack at this moment. For someone to look at her with lustful eyes, she couldn't help but want to slap him. It was just that Jonathan was between the two of them. Otherwise, she really would have slapped the Baldy to make sure that he knew what he was talking about. Looking at the Baldy, who was already gazing at Celine lecherously, Jonathan snorted before speaking. "Although she's not my girl, she has a boyfriend. And, if you really want her, you should ask him first. As for whether you can actually manage to deal with him, we can talk about that as long as you survive the moment that he knows that you were actually trying to hit on his girl." Jonathan continued. Celine, who was so furious a few seconds ago, immediately turned shy. She blushed intensely. But, from the fact that she was so angry that her face had turned red, nobody noticed that she was actually blushing. They all thought that she was simply so angry. Jonathan's voice was so cold that it gave the Baldy goosebumps. He was now regretting the fact that he had actually crossed the line to ask Jonathan about Celine. If she could actually sit next to him, and she wasn't his girl, it was obvious that her status wasn't low. Why would such a girl actually date an old guy like him? That would only happen if her aesthetics were strange. Although he knew that he wasn't supposed to actually mess with Celine any longer considering the level of her status, he couldn't hold in his curiosity. "I'm sorry about that. But who's her boyfriend?" Baldy asked. "Humph." Jonathan snorted and pointed towards the court. It was also at this point that the second quarter was about to begin. Baldy followed the direction that Jonathan was pointing and was stunned the moment that he laid his eyes on Jack. "He's your twin brother?" The corners of Jonathan's lips twitched as he spoke. "He's my cousin. He's the one that is going to play for you this time because he wanted to stretch his muscles a little. Even I cannot beat him. Do you think that you can survive as long as he hears that you were having some kind of ideas on his girl?" The Baldy was already soaked in cold sweat, and his breathing had already become hurried. He knew about the Gesta family. He knew about Jonathan. And he knew for the fact that he couldn't compete against Jonathan. Now, what would happen if the person who was stronger than Jonathan attacked him? Wouldn't he be doomed? What the Baldy didn't know was the fact that Jonathan had decided to use this chance to scare the Baldy so that he could accept the deal faster and not bring stupid conditions during the agreement. Celine, on the other hand, couldn't help but burrow her little head in her hands. At the same time, she was simply thinking, if this was true, perhaps I would be happier, right? Can you not tell him about the incident?" Baldy asked with a shaking voice. "Why don't you ask her if she's going to tell her boyfriend or not?" Jonathan shrugged and glanced at Celine before focusing on the court again. Miss?" Before Baldy could even finish speaking, he was cut off by Celine's cold harumph. The ball was already in the Roosters' possession. The moment that the quarter began, the guy who was holding the ball threw it towards Jack. When Jack received it, he saw that Damien was already rushing towards him. Damien seemed not to think that Jack would give the ball away because he could see how tense the Roosters were and how they hurried to pass the ball to him. Just from this, he could tell that they trusted Jack more. Jack had also stated that Damien was going to lose. In order to prove himself, he was definitely going to try and dribble past him, right? As this thought ran through Damien's mind, he saw Jack bouncing the ball. Seeing this action of his, Damien thought that Jack was a fool to dare to dribble the ball right in front of his opponent. He smiled and stretched his hand, ready to snatch the ball that was still in the air before Jack reacted. His hand managed to get closer to the ball, but It was also at this time that something happened. Jack's hand moved so fast and knocked the ball onto the ground. It bounced off the court and between Damien's legs as it went behind him. As he was still stunned by such a shift in the event, he couldn't react before Jack got past him and took the ball and began dribbling it again.
That, that, that.
As the ball hit the ground 3 times, Damien reacted. He turned around as fast as he could and looked at Jack, who seemed to be waiting for him. At this moment, Damien was both embarrassed and angry. He had just been humiliated. As one of the top players in the top teams, how could he easily be defeated? What's even humiliating was the fact that, instead of dribbling and heading towards the hoop to score, Jack was actually waiting for him. As for the other players who were his teammates, apart from all of them having someone that they were actually blocking, they had never expected that Damien would actually fail to block Jack. Furthermore, it was so simple in that he didn't even react in time. Their mouths hang open, none of them moving forward as they waited for Damien to make a comeback and steal the ball. If Jack could beat Damien, what could they do when they were far inferior to Damien? The Roosters, on the other hand, were excited. They had never thought that they would actually see a person that was stronger than Damien. They no longer thought about how they were trying to make sure that Jack didn't actually play. "Why don't you try shooting from there?" Damien asked. He was obviously not willing to go after the ball after losing the chance. He would only work hard during the next period as long as Jack lost the ball. He also didn't believe that Jack would actually score from here because they were already close to the center of the court. There was almost a half of the court to the basket. "Okay." Jack nodded before he aimed and shot the ball. It arced through the air and went through the basket smoothly. It didn't hit the backboard, and neither did it even touch the rim. It was a perfect shot. There was silence in the entire arena as the only sound that could be heard was the one that came from the basketball hitting the ground as it bounced. Am I seeing things? Of course. This must be us seeing things. That guy simply got past Damien and even scored from such a long distance? What nonsense are you babbling? How can there be a scene where 3 people have all seen the same thing? What 3 people? Don't you see that you can actually stuff a whole egg in the mouths of all the people around here? That's true. But hey, why have I never heard of this guy? He's such a good player. What do you know? This is just a lucky shot. Look at him. He's so young. How can he be a professional basketball player? That's true. He must have gotten lucky because Damien underestimated him. As they talked, being that there were actually 2 opposing sides here, there are obviously those that celebrated that Jack had scored. On the other hand, there were those that were not pleased. This wasn't a simple basketball game. It was a bet between 2 opposing factions, and the stake was a piece of land and a project that was worth billions of dollars. On the court, Jack looked at Damien, who was staring at him incredulously, and asked with a faint smile, "What do you think? You haven't lost yet?" "What do you think? You haven't lost yet?" Damien had previously been dumbfounded when Jack scored from such a distance. It had to be known that even he himself wasn't sure if he could get the ball into the hoop, not to mention as perfectly as Jack did. So, he was indeed surprised that Jack managed to score. "Humph, that must have been a lucky shot," Damien replied as his teammates already began passing and dribbling the ball. Knowing that there was no more time to waste, he left Jack alone and went to his side to wait for the ball. After he received the ball, he made sure to face Jack directly. Currently, they were already 29-5 after Jack scored. So, they were still in front. But even so, Damien dared not to be lax because he knew that this was still the second quarter and it had just began. So, he was going to make sure that he would be able to get past Jack's defense as soon as possible before scoring.
That.
The ball bounced off the court as Damien headed towards Jack. On the other hand, Jack simply waited. He didn't do anything and stood there motionlessly as he observed Damien's moves. Damien moved to the right before switching back to the left. He tried making Jack think that he had passed the ball, but it was still in his hands. But surprisingly, no matter what he did, Jack didn't budge at all. It was like he was rooted to the spot. The only thing that could be seen moving would be his eyes as they followed the ball's movements. Jack saw that there was no reason for him to actually try doing things like bending down and getting ready to snatch the ball. To him, as long as Damien dared to try passing the ball where he would be able to steal it from him. Damien got flustered when he saw that none of his feigned moves were able to make Jack move and give him the space that he so wanted. And, although Jack was simply standing there without moving, he was actually giving him a lot of pressure. After a few seconds of trying but seeing that Jack did not react, Damien thought that perhaps Jack didn't know how to defend. So, he dribbled the ball with the intention of getting past him. He was using his full speed as he thought that it was one of his advantages. But, the moment that he got past Jack, he found his hands empty. He was flabbergasted. It was also at that moment that he heard the sound of the ball bouncing off the court behind him. It turned out that the moment that he got past Jack, Jack had actually managed to steal the ball from him without knowing. Of course, Jack wasn't using his advantage, the professional combat ability. Instead, he was simply using the normal speed, just like the one that Damien was using. It was just that his reaction and timing were sharp, enabling him to snatch the ball away easily. Since you believe that the previous one was a lucky shot, let me prove it to you, Jack stated before he shot from where he was without taking a step forward.
that, that, that.
The sound of the ball bouncing was heard again. But this time, as the ball bounced off the court, the hearts of all those that were watching beat alongside it. There was complete silence once again, as there was disbelief in the faces of those who were watching. The reason for that being simple, they couldn't believe their eyes. If there was somewhere where they could borrow new eyes, they would have. They had seen it again. Damien had been defeated for the second time. The first one was that he failed to block Jack. The second was that he failed to actually get past Jack. And each and every time that he lost badly. Now, they began doubting if it was true that Damien was a professional player. If he was, how could he be dealt with so easily? Go ahead. I would like to see your skills since you believe that you haven't lost, Jack stated as he waited for Damien and his team to make a move. Roosters, on the other hand, were so excited that they were almost laughing maniacally in the court. It was just that they dared not to laugh, because they were worried that Jack had only done this due to luck. Then, they began again. Just like before, the opponents passed the ball to Damien as fast as they could. When he received the ball, Damien looked cautiously at Jack. Although he too would like to believe that it was true that Jack had done the previous defend and attack due to luck, as a basketball player who had a lot of experience, he knew that it was true that Jack had skills. Even though he didn't want to admit it, he had to be extremely serious when facing Jack. And just like always, Jack was standing motionlessly as he looked at Damien. Taking a deep breath, Damien dribbled the ball while heading towards Jack. This time, he feigned going to the left, before turning to the right only to go back to the left. The moment that he got to Jack's left, he dribbled as he had the intention of getting past Jack. But the moment that he got past Jack, he no longer had the ball on his hand. Just then, he heard the sound of the ball bouncing in the distance. It was obvious that Jack had already scored once again, and the gap that was existing between them before was being closed so fast. Currently, they were already 29-11. Jack had already gotten 9 points, while Damien's team had gotten nothing. Now, there was nobody in the entire arena that dared to believe that what Jack was doing was simply due to luck and not his skills. That was nonsense. To be able to snatch the ball twice and score 3 consecutive perfect three-pointers, who would believe that there was actually someone that lucky? The guy who was competing against Baldy was already sweating. He had previously thought that he had already gotten the project. Who knew that things would turn this way the moment that the star of the Roosters came in? Damien was actually being toyed like a junior that knew nothing about basketball at all. This made his expression darken. He had gone through a lot just to be able to make Damien to come and play for him. He had never expected that there would actually be a person that was stronger than him, even though this person was unknown. Baldy, on the other hand, although it was true that the Roosters were closing the gap, he was sweating as his heart beat faster. The more Jack performed, the more distressed he got. Just from the way that Jack was playing, it was a show of his capabilities. So, he was learning just how terrifying Jack was in real sense. He wondered if Celine would actually tell Jack that he had been trying to hit on her. Although he had expected that as long as Jack was sure that he knew how to play the game, he would be able to easily deal with Damien, Jonathan had never expected that he would be this strong. There was a show of skills in the way that he handled the ball. And Jonathan could tell that Jack wasn't using the advantage of being strong to bully Damien. It was just that Jack was reacting at the right time to get the ball. Celine's eyes were already glittering from the excitement as she watched as Jack continued scoring one after the other. Now, she could understand why Jack never took Colin's challenge to heart at all. It wasn't because he was afraid, it was simply because he was too skilled in that he didn't want to play with rookies that didn't even know some of the rules of basketball. The more she watched him, the more she loved him. Had it been possible, perhaps her eyes would have already been shining with the heart shape by now. As the Roosters got more and more excited, their opponents were lamenting. They were now deliberating on whether they were actually supposed to pass the ball to Damien or not. After all, as long as Damien touched the ball, it was counted as a loss. Although they knew that Damien was currently their best player in the court, he had now become their liability. Although they would have liked to substitute him, they knew that even if they did so, who could guarantee that Jack would also leave the court? There was no guarantee, and so it was better to have Damien continue trying his best, as he was the only one in the whole team that had the highest chance of stopping Jack. As the closing quarter was coming close to the end, Jack didn't do much other than scoring from the distance, just like before. The current score was already at 31-32. In total, Jack had already scored 10 times in this quarter, and each and every shot was a three-pointer. The opposing team stood sweating in need of a break and water. Their coach only called timeouts when necessary, and when he called it, everyone on the team side. They all had a much-needed break to rest their throbbing hearts. The pressure that was coming from Jack was definitely not something that they could handle easily. Jack blocked out everything as long as it was related to Damien. No matter what he did, Damien didn't manage to get past Jack. All of this made their morale to drop. On the other hand, the Roosters were so enthusiastic in that they all made sure to get the ball even if the opponents didn't want to pass the ball to Damien. In this way, they would be able to get the ball to Jack and he would score. The opposing side had managed to score twice because they used other players. And this was only because Jack didn't care about them, as he let the Roosters handle that group of people. Not satisfied yet? Jack asked once again after the second quarter ended. I don't believe it. It is simply because you didn't get me at my peak. Just after halftime, I'll show you that I'm not that easy to beat. Damien snorted as he left the court. Jack went back to the resting area for the Roosters. There, the enthusiastic players and the coach surrounded him and tried flattering him. Jack wasn't someone that liked the flattering, so he simply waved them off. These guys didn't disturb his rest at all. They went back and took their seats, but still, they threw glances at him. Their eyes were filled with great respect. Just thinking of the time that they actually thought that Jack wasn't supposed to play with them, they couldn't help but feel embarrassed. Jack, on the other hand, didn't actually need to rest because he wasn't tired at all. There wasn't even a drop of sweat on him because he didn't run around in the court at all. He was simply taking the ball before shooting. When the halftime ended, Jack and the others got back to the court. And just like before, Jack returned to doing what he had done during the previous quarter. This made Damien depressed. No matter how he tried, he actually couldn't get past Jack with the ball in his hand. As long as he went past him, he actually had to leave the ball behind. This was so demeaning to his status as one of the top players in the top teams that were known in the country. He wasn't sure if he could ever raise his head in front of others if they knew that he actually couldn't do a thing to Jack. That's right, he had failed to defend against Jack completely. And what's even more frustrating to him was the fact that he couldn't break past Jack's defense. Jack, on the other hand, could get past him so easily in such a way that it seemed that he didn't seem to exist at all. After several attempts that ended with a failure, Damien finally realized that there was no way that he could actually get past Jack with the ball in his hand. Even now, his teammates were hesitating to pass the ball to him. He had lost all the balls to Jack as long as he approached him. So, these guys were afraid that by passing the ball to him, they would be giving away the ball. Had it not been for the fact that the Roosters were suppressing them in that they had no choice but to give the ball to Damien, they wouldn't even think of giving him the ball. On the other hand, the coach would have already substituted him had it not been for the fact that he didn't want to be on the bad side of this top player. Another thing was that, even if they substituted him, who was going to play better than him? So, it was better for Damien to be embarrassed by Jack rather than the members of his team. In this way, at least they would still maintain the spirit of playing the game in the future rather than for them to be so challenged in that they would actually give up on playing the game. Although he's so good at defending and attacking, that doesn't mean that he can actually block me as long as I use my height advantage. As he thought of this, Damien, who was currently holding the ball in his hand, gazed at the hoop that was behind Jack. Taking a deep breath, he decided that he was simply going to shoot the ball over Jack. This was the only solution that he had in his mind. Although the chances of scoring from such a long distance were lower, he believed that he still had a big chance of getting points in this way rather than believing that he could actually get past Jack and score. As for his teammates, they were simply playing mechanically. None of them had the spirit to play the game at all. Seeing Damien's eyes that were looking past him, Jack immediately knew what he was planning. He was now weak-minded and just wanted to shoot over him, so he was just going to be aggressive with him this time. Damien finally got Jack in the open court and everyone cleared out. It was just Jack and him in the backcourt. Sweat dripping down his face, he knew this was where he can make a change in the game. The crowd went silent. He started to dribble and took about 3 dribbles, then aimed at the hoop that was far behind Jack. Jack didn't hurry up to go and block him because there was no need. He believed that he would be able to stop the ball from getting into the hoop. Damien smiled when he saw that Jack was actually underestimating him. So, he got determined to show Jack that there were situations where he couldn't underestimate a beaten opponent. After making sure that he had gotten the target, Damien shot the ball. He had made sure to make it pass as high as he could to make sure that Jack didn't get close to it at all. In response to this, Jack simply turned around and dashed towards the basket. His speed was so fast that he could actually win the gold medal in Olympics 100m race. Just after a few seconds, he who had a head start due to the fact that he was closer to the basket was able to get closer to the basket just a few microseconds before the ball. The moment that he got there, he wasted no time and jumped into the air. Just the moment that the ball arrived, Jack slapped the ball hard. Bam! Swoosh! The ball shot through the air and then heavily hit the backboard on the opposing side before it landed on the rim. It made 2 circles around the rim before dropping inside. And so, it was another 3 points that had been earned by Jack. This made everyone slack-jawed. They no longer viewed Jack as a human, but a monster. His speed could already break the current Olympics 100m record. Then, the way that he jumped, just the height that he had jumped was enough for him to break the high jump world record. What kind of person was he? To be able to have such amazing basketball skills and physical abilities, no wonder Damien couldn't do a thing to him. He was no match at all. Damien immediately got dispirited. He finally understood that he actually couldn't compete against Jack. It would be better if he had given up earlier rather than to have himself embarrassed to this extent. But all the same, he still looked at Jack with resentment clear in his eyes. He thought that although it was true that he was the one that had failed to yield when Jack said that he wasn't a match, he never expected that Jack would actually humiliate him to this extent. He was someone who was used to being praised by others. He was someone that was used to being arrogant in front of others. He was someone that believed that he would one day become the best of the players in the country and be able to rank amongst the top in the world. But today, Jack had made a good joke out of him. Although the number of people that had watched the match today was small, who could say that they won't go around spreading the video of how he was beaten so easily? As soon as these videos spread, the reputation that he had built over the years would be completely damaged, and he would have to work harder in order to regain it. Even if it was true that the opponent that he was facing was clearly a monster, the others wouldn't care and would go ahead to make fun of him. Since they were not the ones that had been beaten, they would laugh at the injured. For this very reason, he despised Jack. But he dared not to make a move at this point because he knew that they would see him as a sour loser. And as long as they termed him as that, his already damaged reputation would be completely diminished. He looked at the coach and asked for a substitution. Although it could be said to be embarrassing, he thought that it would be better if he could actually leave this place rather than continue being humiliated. The coach was clearly reluctant to replace Damien with his own player. But, looking at the expression on Damien's face, he had no choice but to agree lest he face the anger of this player. The moment that he left the court, Damien left the arena even without changing the jersey. This day, he was going to make sure that he was drowning in alcohol. When the Roosters saw that Damien had left, they laughed out loud at their opponents. Ha ha ha, weren't you guys so arrogant with Damien on your side? Now that he's gone, what are you going to do? Hee hee, you beat us in the first round because our star wasn't here. Now that our star is here, your star had no choice but to flee with his tail between his legs.
Man,
I remember someone saying that our star chickened out. Now, whose star chickened out? Humph. You thought that you could beat us? Dream on. You will always be behind us before you chase us. That's just correct. You only catch up to us because we were waiting for you. In this way, we can give you some false hope that you can surpass us. The opponents began retorting as well. They obviously couldn't accept the fact that they were being taunted like that. They had to retaliate even if they knew that what the Roosters were saying was true. So what? You only depend on your star to be able to beat us. Otherwise, you can't even do a thing to us. Right? Why don't you ask your star to leave the court so that we can compete against each other fairly? What fairly? In the first quarter, why didn't your star stay out so that he can wait for our star to come so that they can compete? You guys are shameless. This is bullying. Bullying you makes me happier. Anyway, why don't you guys look for someone who can bully us as well? That's right. You guys were so smug not long ago. Now that you no longer have something to support you, you simply want to look for a way out. Jack ignored the bantering and went to the guard position. He then spoke to the one that was playing there. You guys can play attacking. Leave the defense to me. You guys can play attacking. Leave the defense to me. The moment that Jack took over the position of defending, the opposing team had no choice but to run around with the ball, but none of them dared to approach the Roosters' hoop. They were afraid that if they did, they would end up embarrassed and, as a result, they would lose their confidence in basketball. As a result, the Roosters who were playing at a full force completely dominated them. Since all the opposing side could do was passing the ball to each other and making a few dribbles, they continued losing the ball while suffering the domineering attacks of the Roosters. The Roosters now no longer cared about the defense. The moment that they got the ball, they would all rush to score. This made their opponents sweat even more. For the first time, having gotten the opportunity to completely crush their opponents, the Roosters decided to use it to the maximum. Substitutions came one after the other as the players wanted to have a taste of beating their archenemy. This went on even during the fourth quarter. Although there were a few guys who had decided to give it a try and attacked the basket that Jack was defending, they all ended up with a failure. By the time that the fourth and last quarter ended with the sound of the buzzer, the Roosters felt dejected as they could no longer continue beating up the tied-up enemy. On the other hand, their opponents were more than happy to see that the game had ended and they no longer had to endure the torture of staying in the same court as the monster. The end result of the game was actually 31-87. Since Jack had decided to play in the defense, the points that were scored by the Roosters had dropped during the last two quarters. But all the same, this was considered a crushing defeat and an overwhelming victory for the Roosters' opponents and the Roosters respectively. Now, the Roosters could finally raise their heads and claim that they had actually thrashed their archenemy. After the match, Jack received the long-awaited system prompt. System task completed. The professional basketball player's skills now permanently belongs to the host. He smiled as he left the court. Since he had completed his part, there was only one thing that remained. That was for him to receive the money that he deserved. After all, he didn't come here to play for free. He had to earn some money for showing off some of his skills. The coach and the players of the Roosters tried inviting Jack to have a meal with them, but Jack refused. Why would he want to spend time with them when he had a beauty that was waiting to accompany him to venture the city? Seeing that Jack had no interest, the coach and the others didn't dare to continue bugging him considering that they knew that he had a terrifying background. So, they were lucky to have him play with them. After getting to the locker room, Jack took a shower before changing back to his clothes. After he got out of the changing room, he found that Celine, Jonathan, and an unfamiliar Baldy were waiting for him. The moment that he showed up, Jonathan went ahead and placed his arm around Jack's shoulder and said, "My good cousin, why don't I organize a few more games for you to play?" Jonathan had a kind smile on his face as he asked, "Get lost. Don't think that I don't know what you were trying to plan." Jack pushed Jonathan away. How could he not know what this guy was thinking? He knew that Jonathan was simply thinking of using him to gain something. As for Jonathan calling him good cousin, since when did Jonathan start referring to him as such? Even after he received the body-strengthening solution for him, this guy was shameless enough to continue arguing with Jack. So, for this guy to turn so nice at this point, he could already tell that this guy was thinking of how to use him to gain a few benefits. If it was true that Jonathan was in a lurch, Jack wouldn't mind helping him out. But the case where he was going to be used, that was something that he wouldn't agree. He would only help if he felt like doing so. Celine chuckled when she saw the grieving expression on Jonathan's face. She had been there when Jonathan muttered that he wasn't going to allow Jack's talent to be wasted. He wanted to make use of Jack's skills so that he could win the competition against a few of his enemies. Seeing that Jack could already see through him, she was happy. After all, she wouldn't want her man to be used by another person even if they were relatives, right? Wait a second. Since when did she start referring to Jack as her man? Celine's eyes widened at the thought. She blushed as she remembered that this thought had actually been implanted into her mind by Jonathan, who had been referring to her as Jack's woman. Jack looked at the blushing Celine and asked with a smile, "Has your heart been captured by my performance today?" Celine blushed further. But all the same, she turned her head around and pretended not to have heard him at all. Jack himself had not noticed that he had been transforming since the very first day that he had arrived in Inchoate City and received the system. The changes were not coming from the system, but from himself. Previously, when he was staying in the Alfonso family mansion, his heart was frozen from the moment that he lost his mother. Having nobody that he cared for in this life, having nobody that cared about him, Jack became superficial in terms of emotions and hid his true self. But after he met with Celine, William, and the others, he had finally began revealing his true self. The cold personality wasn't his to begin with. That was something that he had simply developed due to the environment that he was exposed to. Now that there was no need for him to hide his emotions, Jack had finally began opening up. Although he had yet to completely restore to his true personality, he was still in the process, and it wouldn't be long before he managed to do that. Now, instead of his shallow smiles, Jack began smiling genuinely. But of course, the genuine smiles were only available for those that deserved it and not just anyone. Unfortunately, Jack had yet to realize that he had actually began becoming warm. The ice that had been in his heart had already began melting during the dance in the banquet when he interacted with Celine for the first time. Jack himself didn't know that the main reason for the change that he was experiencing was actually Celine. In front of her, he felt that he could actually be himself. And all of this came from the sense of familiarity that he felt towards Celine. Though, till this day, he had yet to figure out what was the reason behind the familiarity. Jack wasn't the only one that had been warming up. In fact, Celine had been warming up faster than Jack. The reason being that the ice that was covering her heart was small as compared to the one that was in Jack's heart. The coldness and aloofness in Celine had come due to the fact that she was more concentrated in the matters concerning business. The issue concerning the family business had denied her the chance to interact with a lot of her peers. So, other than her parents and grandparents, she had only interacted with Faith, Wendy, Angie, and another girl whose name was Husda. This Husda was the one that Celine had started the Eminent Beauty Company for in Inchoate City. When she met with Jack, Celine was no longer only showing her bright side to him. Instead, to people like Jonathan, she had warmed up to them and would occasionally joke with him. Seeing that Celine was blushing bit, she was actually not admitting that it was true that he had captivated her with his performance today. Jack shook his head and turned his attention to the baldy. For some reasons that Jack didn't know, the baldy was shaking and his forehead had accumulated sweat in that it was already trickling. The baldy kept on wiping his forehead with his handkerchief in about every 30 seconds. Jack couldn't help but try to feel if the temperatures inside the locker room were that high for this guy to actually sweat this profusely. But he didn't detect any abnormality in the temperatures. Although it was true that it was still summer, it was also true that the locker room wasn't that hot for a person to sweat while standing there. Jack could only think that this guy was sweating because he had been running or something. But just then, he noticed another abnormality. That was, this guy seemed so scared of him. Every time that Jack's gaze would fall on him, this guy would actually flinch as if he was afraid that Jack would beat him up. And, for some reason, this guy was stealing glances at Jonathan and Celine. Jack couldn't understand what was going on here. As long as he could remember, he had never interacted with this baldy. Just as he was about to question Jonathan, Jonathan took the initiative to introduce the baldy to him. "Jack, this is the guy that had organized for the match, and he's the one that is supposed to pay you after you won the game. You made him win a project that is worth a few $1 billion after all," Jonathan stated. At the same time, he threw the baldy a knowing glance. The baldy was already terrified of Jack's background. And from the way that he was interacting with Jonathan, He could see that Jack seemed not to treat Jonathan as a superior person to him, but as an equal. Nervously, the Baldy cracked a smile and spoke. Mr. Jack, I would like to thank you for your assistance today. For that reason, I would like to offer you a compensation of $500 million for taking your time to come here today. The Baldy then continued, I would also like to tell Mr. Jonathan that the deal that you proposed has been officially accepted by me. You will receive 60% and I will take the remaining 40% of the profits. Then, to Celine, he looked at her with an apologetic gaze and said, Miss, I would like to offer you 12% shares of my entertainment company, The Rose.